Good day, chaps. So, today's video will cover a vehicle that's a bit of an enigma, because as much as has been written about it, not all of it might be true. And in fact, it leaves more questions than answers. Questions which you, the viewer, might be able to answer, and even win some money. The vehicle in question today is the T18 Boarhound. The Boarhound can arguably trace its ancestry back to the early 1941 period, if not beforehand. And to do this, we need to look at the two nations that might have used it, the US and the UK. The Americans had been trailing behind most European nations in terms of equipment and training prior to its entry into the Second World War, having only created its armoured force in July 1940. Before this, they had politically and militarily doctrinated themselves into a bit of a pickle around the terminology of what is an armoured car and what is a tank. Prior to the war, the US had armoured cars fulfilling the role of cavalry, such as the M1 armoured car, a relatively fast 6x6 with a .50 heavy machine gun. And then you had light tanks, also fulfilling the role of cavalry. But the term tank was not allowed, as the US felt that tanks belonged in the role of supporting infantry. Thus the light tanks were called combat cars, leading to vehicles like the M1 combat car, a relatively fast-tracked vehicle with .50 machine guns. And finally, you had other light vehicles coming in, such as the M1 scout car, and you guessed it, a relatively fast vehicle armed with a .50 machine gun. And of course, being truly American, they all ended up being called M1 just to make life easier. These vehicles each had their own pros and cons. The conventional armoured cars were faster on roads and hard surfaces, and are generally easier to maintain than tracked vehicles are. They're also a lot quieter, which makes them useful for reconnaissance work. Tracked vehicles, on the other hand, are also much better suited to off-road conditions and muddy ground, and are far more adaptable to increased protection and firepower than wheeled vehicles are. With the formation of the armoured force, a new doctrine began to rear its head in 1941, the tank destroyer branch, where the main weapon of choice was the 37mm gun, and mobility was heavily emphasised in favour of defensive protection, and the formation would have forward reconnaissance cars to identify the armoured threat. As a result of this, the US began to consider three distinct classes of armoured car, light, medium and heavy, with the prefix based on the vehicle's armour and not the mounted firepower, and this led to the work beginning on a variety of projects and ideas. Meanwhile, over in Blighty, the situation was not too dissimilar to the American one. Like our colonial chums, we also had light armoured cars to do recce work, as well as light tanks for the same purpose, and most were, in all honesty, pretty bloody useless. But then one has to remember that these vehicles, along with the preceding light machines, were primarily designed for colonial policing, fending off pygmies with particularly sharp slices of mango. Other armoured cars, such as the Rolls-Royce, had already been stationed out in the Middle East, but again, while sound policing vehicles were very lightly armed and armoured. New designs had been creeping in slowly since 1939, but even with the sharp shock and kick in the arse brought around by the loss of France, many vehicles were only appearing in dribs and drabs by 1941, and often sent straight over to Africa where the war was now being fought. Some of these vehicles over time would prove to be exceptionally good armoured cars, featuring very heavy armour and large caliber guns, or great mobility and reliability, and carried on into service decades after the war, while others would not. And as a general rule, most of these vehicles were now in a 4x4 layout. But during the fall of France and early African campaign, the UK had been very impressed with the German 8x8 heavy armoured reconnaissance vehicles, enough to try and mirror and emulate these vehicles into British service. But they were also under no illusion that our own manufacturing capability was extremely bottlenecked and working at full capacity, replacing what had been lost, and there was very little time to begin designing new concepts with invasion at the door, and so we began to look to our allies for new vehicles. The UK, although facing shortages and doing its best to turn out as much as it could, also asked their emissaries over in the US and the British Purchasing Commission if they could acquire a medium or heavy, multi-wheeled armoured car for the use of North Africa. And so our two stories merge, with the US wanting a series of light, medium and heavy armoured cars, and the UK also requiring such a machine for the African campaign. During this time, another vehicle had also been developed in the US from the Trackless Tank Corps, sometimes called the Trackless Tank Company online. This American firm had been developing wheeled vehicles since the late 1930s, and had been focusing its time on producing an 8x8 machine as part of a private enterprise, rather than an ordered requirement, with the aim of cross-country reconnaissance in mind, and it had been running tests in 1940 with a turretless hull. Although this vehicle met some scepticism from the Army and Ordnance branches, who tended to be wary of anything new, it proved capable enough for a second look at Aberdeen in March 1941. And following this, a contract for 2 further prototypes was to be built and paid for by the Army under the name T18. This unusual vehicle has also gathered interest from both the US as well as Canadian, British and Australian onlookers, all who saw the demonstrations were impressed with the cross-country capability, and they saw merit in the independent suspension system. But the US and UK voiced concerns over its weight, crew layouts, and the company's inexperience to handle large-scale military projects. The T-13 would end up getting a small turret fitted with a 37mm gun and renamed T-13E1. Yet as time passed, it became increasingly clear to the US Army that the T-13 was not going to go anywhere fast, despite an initial desire for 1,000 vehicles. Pressure was applied on that firm to then merge or partner up with somebody who knew what they were doing, even after the company had more or less been forced into merging its vehicles with others, including the Huber Company, Mack Manufacturing, and finally Rio. But ultimately there were too many fundamental flaws, and the project was cancelled. Yet the idea had sparked enough interest, and when it became obvious early on that the Trackless Tank Corps was going nowhere, officials pushed for a parallel project which could be put out to tender for American firms for a medium and heavy armoured car, which would be given the numbers T-17 and T-18, and for the UK export that would be the Staghound and the Boarhound. And from here on we also need to look at 2 other different vehicles, all of which got pretty far in development and ran parallel to the American development of the T-18. For the first of these, we actually have to look at work being carried out in South Africa with the Marmon Herrington armoured cars, which is a bit of a misnomer, as Marmon Herrington only ever made the drivetrain, while other firms such as Ford or Warford made the rest. To prevent confusion, those that saw service with the Commonwealth armies, including UDF soldiers, used the Marmon name, while those used in domestic roles were known as the South African Reconnaissance Cars, or SARCs. Yet the names appear to be fairly interchangeable, and either can be found in common use. A large number of SARCs were found serving in the North African campaign. Most of these were the lighter 4x4 variants with just machine guns, although some heavier 4x4s with 2-pounder guns came into service by 1943. These vehicles tended to be the eyes and ears of the army, expected to go out for days at a time and monitor German positions. And they were also very vulnerable to things like German fighters, who took every opportunity to attack them whenever they could, often by flying at 10 foot above the ground and hose-piping them. In fact, one poor SARC armoured car was chased for over an hour by 15 fighters while he ducked and weaved his way back to friendly cover. But the 2 vehicles of interest to this story were both 8x8 vehicles. The first was the SARC Mark V, which began in April 1941 with a requirement by the Director of War and Supplies to develop an 8x8 vehicle, like the German vehicles, for the home use and by the British, who requested such a machine. This vehicle was ready in February 1942, and it mounted a 2-pounder 40mm gun in a fully rotating turret with a well-armoured body. The vehicle used 2 160 horsepower Albion petrol engines, and had between 40 to 60mm of armour on the front and 20mm on the sides. However, during testing in August 1942, the 16-ton vehicle was found to be wanting in loose sand, which is a bit unfortunate for a vehicle that was supposed to be used in the desert. This was due to the power only being delivered to the front and back axles, so she tended to dig herself into loose sand very quickly. Yet over hard ground she was found to be very fast with excellent handling, but her off-road performance lost the interest of the British and she was later broken up. In August 1941, a second order was issued for 2 prototype 8x8 vehicles to be built on Warford truck parts with Marmon Herrington axles. This vehicle would also be lighter, with 30mm of armour and a 2-pounder gun. But unlike the earlier machine, the Mark VI also got redirected to be able to mount a 6-pounder gun in November 1941, a feature which would be mirrored in other vehicles in this video around the same time period. An order for 250 vehicles was placed for use by the UK, with the first working prototype having a 2-pounder in a custom-made open-top turret and was ready for April 42. A further 2.30 machine guns had been added, which could rotate around the open turret section to provide anti-aircraft protection, and the first trials were carried out in November 1942, where the vehicle was able to reach speeds of up to 40 miles per hour quite comfortably across country. A 6-pounder turret was also fitted in January 1943, which is sometimes mistakenly called a Crusader turret, which it's not, and apart from vaguely looking like one at a distance, it's very much its own thing. And yet, in a pattern that will become more common, delays and bottlenecks in equipment would prevent the Mark VI from realistically going into full production before August 1943. And with the war situation changing and Germany getting a bit of a thick ear in North Africa, the need for these vehicles changed and the British withdrew their order for 250 vehicles. South Africa itself would carry on for a few more years with its order for 100 vehicles, but in the end only 2 would ever be built. The 2-pounder version remains at the Bovington Tank Museum, while the 6-pounder version remains in the South African Museum. The other vehicle to cover in this time period is also the Canadian Wolf Mark I. This vehicle began around August 1940 as a proposal by the Department of Munitions and Supply. The Canadians had questioned whether they would have adequate industry capability to provide large numbers of tracked vehicles, although they were in a position to be able to churn out wheeled vehicles much more readily. As such, they developed a series of wheeled vehicles, with the largest being the Wolf 8x8 heavy armoured car, which the British showed some interest in, particularly as a working prototype was ready by around December 1941. The UK liked what it saw. Here was a heavy armoured car, one that mounted the Ram tank turret, with a 2-pounder gun, as well as the potential for a larger gun, and would be well armoured up to 60mm. Yet they were very cautious around other features, such as the choice of 3 Mercury engines, preferring a single larger American engine, and they also raised questions over the internal layout and armour shape. The vehicle, which was originally to be called Buffalo and later changed to Wolf as it sounded more aggressive, would never end up in service, however. The Canadians would have issues sourcing the engines and casting the plates required, and there were issues with steering and other problems, all of which might take up to 18 months to fix, delaying the vehicle to 1944. And so much like the South African vehicles, the UK decided to cancel this and proceeded with the American vehicles, which they hoped they'd be able to acquire in the necessary time needed. So, back to the US, where we got our Staghound and a Boarhound. On the Boarhound front, 2 vehicles were planned, the T18 and the T18E1. The former was to be in an 8x8 configuration, and the latter in a 6x6 layout. A wooden concept model was made before any working concepts were produced, and yet this was good enough for a placement of a large contract. The initial order placed on December the 24th, 1941, was for 2,500 units to be delivered by June 1943, but this was quickly changed to 2,500 units by December the 31st, 1942, in a following letter issued just 3 days later, and a further order was placed for 300 more T18s in March 1942. The contract was placed with the Yellow Cab division of the General Motors Company, which was somewhat alarming to the firm, purely on the numbers needed and the timescale allocated, as the company felt it would take 6 months to get the parts, tools and jigs in order, leaving just 5 to 6 months to complete 2,500 vehicles, around 500 per month, needing over £500,000 of material use per day. The firm felt that it would be better to produce a smaller batch, growing in number per month at an upsold value to the UK, so that any issues could be weeded out as they progressed. Yet this was soon revised again, with a lower estimated number of 5 vehicles being ready by September 1942, and by December production would be up to 50 vehicles per month, a lot less than the proposed 500 planned. The original vehicle itself was designed as an 8-wheel drive, 4-wheeled steering armoured vehicle with a 37mm gun and a coaxial .30, with a 360-degree power-operated turret and a further .30 machine gun in the hull. Each vehicle would carry a crew of 5, 3 in the turret, and a gunner and a radioman in the bow, and protection would be 2 inches or 50mm of armoured plate in the hull front, and around 82mm in some parts of the turret face at the thickest. The side armour was 31mm, 25mm on the rear, and 19mm on the top and bottom. The original spec called for 2 GMC 329 petrol engines, delivering 250 horsepower in total, or 125 horsepower each in the rear of the hull, running through automatic transmissions to the 8 driving wheels, for 50 miles per hour or 80 kilometers an hour over reasonable ground. The UK recorded the engines as 127 brake horsepower, and a top speed of 51.5 miles an hour was achieved after 17 seconds. Transmission-wise, one engine was connected to the first and third axle, and the other to the second and fourth axle. And on normal ground, only the rear 4 wheels would be powered, but should wheel slip occur, automatic pickup drives would connect, giving the vehicle 8x8 traction. Good cross-country abilities were also achieved through freely articulated suspension systems, in which any wheel on one side could be raised by 20 inches, or a complete axle by 18 inches, without increasing the weight on any other axle, and responsive steering would be obtained by turning all 4 front wheels by means of power steering. Now all of this led to a pretty chunky vehicle. In fact, for a time, she had more armour than most tanks being fielded by either side, and was considered better protected than the German Panzers, and much heavier by 6 tons or more than many British tanks. At just over 6 metres long, over 3 metres wide, and at 2.6 metres tall, the Boarhound was, as a reconnaissance vehicle, anything but stealthy. The initial T18 prototype came with a 37mm American gun, which was fairly standard for the time, being mounted on many US vehicles of the period. It was more than adequate for dealing with other armoured cars, and quite capable even against the early Panzers up to the Mark IV found in North Africa, although it did lack a useful high explosive capability. This was then fitted into a small Rockwell-type turret similar to that found on the T-17 Staghound. In early 1942, the British decided to change their minds on some of the specifications, notably around the main armament. They now wanted a 6-pounder gun, or 57mm piece, to match the changes in enemy armour, as well as tank and gun development in the UK, although at the time the 6-pounder guns were still in very short supply. The Americans themselves did not begin to use the 57mm until the spring of 1943, still favouring the 37mm gun. But they had been producing a cloned version of the British 6-pounder since February 41 in small numbers, with mass production being well underway by 1942. This would of course require some major rework on the T18 Boarhound, now renamed T18E2, as not only would it need a new turret, which would be a reworked turret from the M7 medium tank, but the internal fittings would need to be adjusted for the new ammunition. However, this delay in upgunning the Boarhound would also help spell its own doom, as the retooling and changes would delay production further, particularly around the 57mm gun mounts and clutch throwout bearings, and the first prototype would not be out until October or November of 42. Although this particular vehicle had a short, stumpier 57mm gun, also seen on the T7E2 tank, while later ones would have the longer, tapered 57mm M1 type guns. But even before it entered service, the Boarhound's fate was also rapidly approaching, with the US Ordnance Branch no longer showing much interest in a vehicle this size for a reconnaissance machine, and they began to wrap the project up. And by November 1942, they no longer had any interest in pursuing the vehicle. However, the British were still somewhat keen to get the vehicles they had paid for, and quite how much they paid in total is not recorded. In an AFV situation report written in February 1943, it was recorded that some 29 vehicles were on the production line, and that a further 58 hull casts and 90 side armour casts had been produced, and that perhaps it might be worth finishing these for a complete unit to be operational, a matter which was passed to the Director General of Fighting Vehicles, but does not appear to have been approved, as only the 30-odd vehicles on the production line would ever be finished. Yet even by August 1943, the British Army staff in America were still receiving and producing guides and maintenance books for the Boarhound. These vehicles would be produced in dribs and drabs until May 1943, with various numbers shown as ready, with official sources varying. The British were still testing their Boarhound at Chertsey until 1944. Overall, these British trials went fairly well, despite being nearly a year after the order had been cancelled. The notable issues found were that the brakes were inadequate and would quickly overheat. The hill climbing was reported as okay, albeit not as good as some of the other armoured cars, and there was a tendency to wheel spin if it was forced to do a hill start. The transmission was found to be pernickety and prone to playing up, and was particularly difficult even for trained fitters to locate and find the root of the problem. Other issues were minor and fixable. Corrections to the driver's seat, the towing eyes being too weak, and fuel drum snaps broke, all quite workable problems. One thing that was recorded was the turning radius, which was 78 to 79 foot. This is very large, nearly 25 metres or so, which would have made the vehicle utterly unusable in some areas. Yet, despite being recorded, there didn't seem to be any undue criticism of this. The UK trials were stopped in November 1944, and simply recorded that no further action is to be done with the Boarhound, and the vehicle is to be disposed of. Today the Boarhound still leaves us with many questions. Exactly how many were made, and how many ever reached the UK? We know at least one did in testing, and a Boarhound is seen at both the Lincoln and the London victory celebrations, yet whether it's the same one is not certain. And to date there are no known photos of more than one Boarhound in any one photo. Today only one vehicle is known to exist, which is gathering dust at the Conservation Centre at Bovington Tank Collection. This vehicle is all that remains, and it's a bit of a mystery as sadly over the years it's had a lot of cheap paint slapped all over it, and any original markings have vanished. One can only hope that the original serial number plates are left inside. Well guys, I hope you like this ramble about Boarhounds. It would be nice to find out more, and maybe in the future I'll find some more information in the archives. But that's all for today. Catch you next time. Toodle pip.